Hey, it's FYF Sports, man. It's Lamont, man. We back. Back with another. I wouldn't even call this breaking news, man, because this is not breaking news, because it's not new to me, or it's not news to me, but this may come as breaking news to a lot of 90s basketball fans. And I really didn't want to do this video. I really didn't want to do this video, but the slander and the hate towards this era of basketball has just been astronomical. And so, I think I might be the first person on YouTube to ever admit this publicly, because a lot of people say this. Or a lot of people think it in the back of their minds. But because they know that 90s fans can be so toxic, they just don't want to say it out loud. But it's FYF Sports, man. You know what the FYF mean? Forget your feelings. Feelings got to get removed from this whole equation. And so when we sit back and think about 90s basketball, the first thing that people say about 90s basketball is they say that the 90s was the era of the big man. 90s was there. I mean, as we can see right here, we got 3 Hall of Famers right here. We got David Robinson, all-time great. We got Akeem Olajuwon, all-time great, man. Shaquille O'Neal, we know, probably the most dominant center we've ever seen in the NBA. And these 3 figureheads are used to prop up the 90s as if the bigs of the 90s were just so much better than any other era. That is unbelievable. And so I'm just here to debunk that. That's what I do. I just debunk things by just bringing up the facts. And I'll be the first person on YouTube to just go ahead and expose this information. Because again, people trash on this era. They say that bigs of this era are not that good. But, at least this era is admittedly a point guard and shooting guard era. This era, we don't profess to have the best bigs. We don't profess that. The 90s professed to have the best bigs of all time. Across the board. They were just so deep. Every team, night in and night out, Akeem Olajuwon, David Robinson, Shaquille O'Neal played against Hall of Fame bigs. Not only were they Hall of Fame bigs, but they played against Hall of Fame bigs. That's the premise that you're led to believe. So, I'm not even going to hold you up because I know it's late at night. Got a lot of stuff to do tomorrow. I got to get my hair cut. I'm looking crazy right now. I'm tired. My eyes are bloodshot. But man, this FYF Fred right here. He always either gets me up really early in the morning, or he just keeps me up really late at night just to teach y'all basketball. So we're gonna get straight to the facts, you guys. We're gonna get straight to the facts, man. And we're gonna start off with the top 20 centers of the 90s, and we're gonna just really break down who was elite out of this group, what centers were elite, and who were these players that they were going up against night in and night out that just made the competition that they played so great. The defense was so great. It was so physical. It was so tough. What made this era so great? So we're just going to go ahead. We're going to break down the centers of the 90s. And I think once I unveil this list, it's going to expose the truth about the 90s. And again, I'll say it now and I'll say it at the end of the video. Centers of the 90s were trash. Astronomically trash. And by no means could they compete with centers of this era at all. And I'll go ahead and, like I said, we'll start with the number 20 center of the 90s. And I'm going to break down 20 centers of the 90s. This way, nobody can say I left anybody off the list. The 20 best centers of the 90s. And not only are we going to break down the 20 best centers of the 90s, we're going to break down who were the all-stars, who were the greats, and what made them great. All right, so first up on this list, we got Zydrunas Ilgauskas. Now he's better known for what he did in the 2000s towards the end of his career. Because the Eastern Conference was so depleted with bigs, he was able to sneak his way into a few All-Star games, but that was in the 2000s. As far as the 90s goes, he was a bum. He never made an All-Star game. He was just a very average center. He's never been known as a great defender. He can't move his feet. In a sense, he could be a rim protector, but, most bigs are decent rim protectors when they don't have to move their feet. So we got the number 20 center. We got Zydrunas Ilgauskas, the number 20 center. Definitely did not do anything spectacular in the 90s. Definitely did not pose any threat to anyone in the 90s. And that's 100% fact. So we're just going to go ahead, and again, our job is to expose the facts. And so we're going to go ahead and go to the number 19 center of the 90s. The number 19 center of the 90s was Benoit Benjamin. Now, a lot of people, and even a lot of 90s fans will pronounce this guy's name wrong. They'll say his name is Benoit Benjamin. No, this guy's from France. His name is Benoit Benjamin. You can see the jersey that he has on. He was on one of the worst teams in basketball in the 90s, the Clippers. They were trash, and he was trash. He's known for doing nothing. And again, I can't think of anything that he's done good in his whole career other than play for the worst team of the 90s, which was the Los Angeles Clippers. So we're just going to move past him. He didn't make any All-Star games. He didn't make any All-First teams. He was 100% garbage. So we're just going to check. And another thing we're going to do with each center is we're going to check the box off. Could Draymond Green guard this center? Because I know a lot of people, whenever I talk about players like Draymond Green or just anybody of this era, the first thing they ask is, could he guard Hakeem or could he guard the centers of the 90s? Well, so far, we're 2 for 2. Draymond Green could definitely guard Zydrunas Ilgauskas. He was too slow. And Draymond Green could definitely guard Benoit Benjamin of the Los Angeles Clippers. Again, one of the worst teams of the 90s, historically bad, the Los Angeles Clippers with Benoit Benjamin. Next at 18, we actually have an NBA champion here. We have an NBA champion in Luke Longley. Everybody who remembers watching those Bulls games, every time he touched the ball, this crowd would. When I was little, I thought the crowd was just saying boo, but they'll be yelling Luke. They'd be yelling Luke. That they had a special thing whenever he touched the ball. It doesn't take away from the fact that he was a pure bum out of Australia. He was 100% bum. I don't think he would make an NBA roster if he played in this era. He's too slow, can't shoot, not very mobile, wasn't a great screen setter. He was an average defender, never made an All-Star game, never made an All-NBA team. Definitely did not pose a threat to David Robinson, Hakeem Olajuwon, or Shaquille O'Neal. So I'm sure that those guys dominated him on a night in and night out basis. So that's what we have. At number 18, we got Luke Longley, the champion, 3-time champion with the Chicago Bulls. He rode the coattails of Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. But again, Jordan didn't need a center. Jordan really didn't need a power forward. Jordan didn't need any bigs on his roster to win championships or to dominate the 90s. Luke Longley was there because he was the cheapest center that they could find that could do a serviceable job. The same way Bill Cartwright was on the Bulls team when Bill Cartwright played in the early 90s on those Jordan championship teams. Luke Longley filled the Bill Cartwright role in the 90s. That's what Luke Longley did. 100% pure bum. Didn't do anything spectacular other than look good, winning championships behind Jordan, Pippen, and Phil Jackson. Again, this is Luke Longley. And again, this is not hate. This is just facts. Never made an All-NBA team. Never made an All-NBA defensive team. So he wasn't elite in those categories. Never made an All-Star game. That's all we can really say about Luke Longley of the Chicago Bulls. But he is a 3-time champion. Next up, we got Marcus Camby. Now, Marcus Camby actually had a lot of promise. Coming out of UMass, playing with John Calipari out of UMass. This guy, man, at number 17, had a lot of promise. All right, so defensively, I'm not even going to lie. This guy was elite defensively, but offensively, this guy was horrendous. If you ever saw a shooting for him, it looked like he never touched a basketball a day in his life. He couldn't shoot free throws, couldn't shoot the basketball at all. And again, in the 90s, centers didn't, to make a team in the 90s, you didn't even have to know how to shoot a basketball. If you could do one thing like defend at a high level, you could make a roster. You didn't have to know how to shoot. You didn't even have to know how to make free throws. If you could defend, if you were long and lengthy, you could be on a team. And what made this even better was this guy was actually athletic. He was move. He could move his feet. He was a good defender. I don't think he really posed much of a threat to guys like Shaq, Hakeem, and David Robinson. Those three guys were just too elite. But Marcus Camby was serviceable. But on the offensive end, he was atrocious. Definitely atrocious. But in the 90s, he never made an all-star game. So I can't say he was really that good in the 90s, because if he was, he would have actually made an all-star game in the 90s. He made 0 all-star games in the 90s. So Marcus Camby, a very average player in the 90s. He came out of UMass with a lot of promise, a lot of hype that he never lived up to. Marcus Camby at number 17. Next up, we got John Hot Rod Williams. You know, I don't even know much about this man's game other than the fact he had one of the smoothest names in basketball. He had a smooth name, John Hot Rod Williams. That was the best thing about this man's game. His name was John Hot Rod Williams. Next, at number 16, Arvydas Sabonis. Now, this is one of my favorite teams. This guy right here, actually, when I was young, when I was very little, when he played in the NBA, he was one of the guys that made me love the Portland Trail Blazers. This is why I'm still a Portland Trail Blazer fan today. Unfortunately for Arvydas Sabonis, the best part of his career was when he was overseas, and he came to the NBA late. He was known for being the oldest rookie in NBA history. When he came into the league, he was the oldest rookie ever in NBA history. That's what he's known for. He still was able to dominate. So even at 30 years old, coming into a league that he was unfamiliar with, Arvydas Sabonis was able to come in and dominate to a certain degree. Even though he was slow, even though he couldn't jump, he was an extremely smart player, and he was just able to outsmart some of these guys in the 90s, primarily because they just weren't really that good of basketball players. Again, there's this myth that these 90s bigs were just so great. That's not true. Arvydas Sabonis as a foreigner, at that point in time, overseas basketball, those players were looked at as soft. They were not looked at, NBA players looked down on them. Same way they did Tony Kukoc, the same way they did Drazen Petrovic. When these guys came over here, they were not respected. They had to earn respect. And Arvydas Sabonis actually came in the 90s. He earned some respect. He was a fairly decent player, but the unfortunate part about this, we never got to see him in his prime in the NBA. But he was pretty decent. I can't really knock his game, because by the time he came to the NBA, he was older. And when you're 30, 31 in the NBA, that's considered old man status. And in the NBA years, and then he was also dealing with knee injuries, which also hampered him as well. So we have Arvydas Sabonis. Next up, we got Shawn Bradley, man. One of the tallest men in basketball. One of the tallest players we've seen in the NBA. I know on NBA Jam. On NBA Jam, this dude is crazy. This dude blocks everything on NBA Jam. But as far as real life, Shawn Bradley was just a walking stop sign. He didn't do anything. He just stood there. He wasn't very mobile at all. He wasn't very mobile at all. He wasn't a great offensive player. The primary reason why he was able to score in the 90s, if you guys go back and watch his games, it wasn't because he was elite offensively or anything like that. The man was just 7'7". He was just bigger and taller than everyone. So he would just score. He didn't have to leave the ground to dunk the basketball. And in the 90s, that's all you needed to be able to do to score. The defense was not very complex. The defense was not very elite. This is not me. All you have to do is go back and watch the games. Just go back and watch the games. Watch how this man played. All right. But unfortunately for Shawn Bradley, even with his height, this man never made an all-star game in the 90s. He never made an all-star game in the 90s. 90s fans will tell you that he was some great center. He was some unstoppable force. That's what they'll say. The man was not elite. The man never made an all-NBA team, first or second. The man never won Defensive Player of the Year. Even with his height and shot blocking ability, and never made an all-star game. So that's Shawn Bradley. That summarizes his career. Towards the end of his career, obviously he got riddled with injuries that forced him out the league. But this is that's Shawn Bradley for you. Nothing spectacular, nothing special. And again, Draymond Green could easily guard this guy. He's too slow. He's too weak. Draymond Green will push him out the post. And he posed no threat to players like David Robinson, Hakeem Olajuwon or Shaquille O'Neal. So that was another cakewalk matchup for these three guys that actually did dominate the 90s. We're going to move on to the next. Next up, we got Vlade Divac. Now, Vlade Divac, similar to Arvydas Sabonis, came to the NBA late. He became Hall of Fame worthy overseas. He played most of his career overseas where he was elite. He came to the NBA when he was older. And even being older, he was able to come into the NBA and then dominate to some degree. And I don't want to really say he dominated because he never made an all-star team in the 90s. He never posed a threat to players like Shaq, players like Hakeem or David Robinson. He didn't stop those guys whatsoever. And again, he came into the NBA, and again, you got to understand he was playing against centers like Benoit Benjamin, Luke Longley, Marcus Camby, Hot Rod Williams, Sabonis, and Shawn Bradley. These are the guys that are ranked below him. So again, there were a lot of centers, and then again, there are a multitude of other centers on other teams that were worse than these guys that he was able to go up against and have success against. So we have Vlade Divac, who again, he had some of his best years in the NBA in Sacramento, but even at that point in time in the 2000s, Shaquille O'Neal was just too dominant. Shaquille O'Neal dominated him on a night in, night out basis and made him look like a little kid in the post. So we got Vlade Divac, who is next on our list. Next up, man, we got, this is one of James Hayes' favorite go-to guys, Rony Seikaly. I hope I'm pronouncing his name wrong. Now, I remember this guy. This guy definitely is on NBA Jam. He's trash on NBA Jam, so you get one strike for that you're trash on NBA Jam. There's nothing, like I said, there's nothing memorable that you did in the 90s other than you were just a hard-nosed player that fouled a lot. I don't think you would make an NBA roster in this era. You're too slow. How you were able to score the way you scored in the 90s is amazing. It is amazing, but it doesn't surprise me because if we look at some of the centers in the 90s, they were actually trash. And again, I'm just here to expose it. This man made no All-Star games, none in the 90s, made no All-NBA teams. So he wasn't elite. So I can't consider you elite if you're not one of the top in your position, at least for 1 year. I just want to see one of these bigs excel for 1 year out of the 90s. Just be great for 1 year, sneak into one of those teams, maybe even sneak into one of these defensive teams. Maybe even sneak and do like Draymond Green did and win you a defensive player of the year. None of these guys were able to do that. The 90s was such a great era. The 90s was dominated by great bigs. That's the myth. That's what a lot of 90s fans will throw at you. Unfortunately for Ronnie, he was light work for guys like Shaquille O'Neal, Hakeem Olajuwon, and David Robinson. So again, another cakewalk matchup for these three top guys right here. Another cakewalk matchup. Rony Seikaly posed no threat to the elite centers of the NBA, nor was he an elite center himself. That's Rony Seikaly of the Miami Heat. Now, what's so funny is when I looked at centers of the 90s, I had to throw Bill Lambert in there. And even though he did the majority of his damage in the 80s, because there were no other centers to choose from, he did play in the 90s, and he was pretty solid in the 90s because the centers in the 90s were trash. But I had to put Bill Lambert on this list because of that fact alone. Now, he didn't do anything spectacular in the 90s. He was pretty good in the 80s. In the 90s, he didn't make any All-Star games or anything like that. He was serviceable, but he was not spectacular. Again, he was older. He was smarter than a lot of these guys. And again, when you compound the fact that a lot of these guys were basketball dummies, along with the fact that we're not athletically gifted and they couldn't move their feet, with the time that he spent with the Pistons in the 80s, he learned a lot, and he was able to compete with some of these younger guys who came in the 90s, like Marcus Camby. But again, in the 90s, he was older. He was on his way to retiring. He wasn't an extremely skilled player. He was one of the first bigs that could actually shoot the ball. I mean, that's really all he could do in the 90s, but it wasn't good enough to get him on an all-star team or on an all-NBA team. But from what he did in the 80s, he is a Hall of Fame player. I'll give him that much. But in the 90s, He was average. And again, he posed no threat to Shaquille O'Neal, Hakeem Olajuwon, or David Robinson. They made, they made mincemeat out of him. He was light work. But that's Bill Lambert, great career in the 80s, though. Next up, we got the Chief, Robert Parish. Another player who, whenever he touched the ball, when I was little, whenever he touched the ball when he played with the Bulls, I thought people were booing this man. I didn't know what he did to the Bulls fans, but now I come to see that they were saying Chief. They were saying Chief, the Chief, They were giving him his props on the way out of the door. Now, those years that he had with the Bulls, he was extremely trash. I don't know. He had gray hairs popping all out of his head, and he walked like he needed a cane. I don't know how he was still in the league at that time, but you have to understand, during the years that he had with the Bulls in the 90s, all you needed was somebody who's 7 feet tall. He didn't have to be able to walk. He didn't have to be able to stand straight. He just needed to be 7 feet tall and play with Michael Jordan, and he could make a roster. So again, he was the most affordable backup center that they could find. They found him. He was playing with the Bulls all the way. He played in the league all the way up until he was 43. A 43-year-old center. I don't know if bigs can even survive past 37, 38, or 9 in the league today. The game is just too fast. Players are just too elite. He wouldn't be able to survive. Now, he came into the league in, I want to say he came into the league in 1976. So he had 14 years, some in the 70s and the 80s, where he was pretty solid. I give him that. But as far as the 90s go, he actually, in 1990, he actually had a year. 1990, he averaged 15 and 10 and snuck his way into an All-Star game. But you got to think, look at some of the bigs of the 90s. They were not very elite. So he was able to finesse his way into that 1990 All-Star game. It could have been just a parting gift because, again, he was so dominant in the 80s. Voters see Robert Parish, yeah, we got to get him in there. And that's just a favor. That's a thank you gift for what you did. That's the thank you gift for what you did in the 80s. But this is Robert Parish, a one-time All-Star in the 90s. Not very spectacular. Definitely did not pose a threat to players like Shaq, Hakeem, or David Robinson. But there we have Robert Parish, at 40 years old, was able to be better than a lot of centers in the 90s because they were just so trash. That's Robert Parish for you. Hey, but definitely Hall of Fame career from the 70s and the 80s. You did dominate the 70s and the 80s. Unfortunately for the 90s, bigs were trash, and you happen to be a part of that fold. Next up, we got Kevin Duckworth. Unfortunately, this man has passed away. So definitely rest in peace, Mr. Duckworth. But we still have to talk about your basketball game, Mr. Duckworth. Now, Mr. Duckworth, on my Blazers team, I definitely appreciated his time with the Blazers. He was solid. He was definitely solid. He even made one All-Star game. But at the end of the day, Mr. Duckworth, you were not an elite center. You were not an elite center by any means. You're definitely not a Hall of Famer, and that's no knock to your game. You just weren't. But you were solid. Now, would you make the NBA today? I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think you were too slow. He had a tendency to foul a lot, and that's what held him back. Again, but the 90s basketball was filled with a lot of hacks. Guys didn't know how to play without holding you, grabbing you, or fouling you. And if you could still score through all of that, then they would just throw you to the ground. Again, guys in the 90s didn't know how to move their feet. And again, and just like Jordan with the Jordan rules, if you could score even through the contact, then they would just hack you and knock you to the ground and turn it into a football game because they were too slow to even guard you in the first place. So that's just 90s basketball. Now, because coaches had some decent defensive schemes, but there was no matchup zone. There was no such thing as the matchup zone at that time. It was not necessarily truly understood to the degree that it is today. I felt like if coaches were implementing the matchup zone in the 90s, a lot of these bigs who we say are good would not have been as effective, because you would not have to worry about bigs kicking it out to shooters, because even in the 90s, guys were just less prone to shoot the three. They did not want to shoot the three ball as much. Again, Kevin Duckworth, again, I mean, you're on our list here, but made one All-Star game, so get props to you. You definitely were not all NBA, or I wouldn't say you were an elite defender in the 90s. You were serviceable. That's the best way I can describe your game. But I appreciate your time with the Portland Trail Blazers. It's my favorite team, y'all. We got next up, we got Rick Smith, the Dutchman. Man, out of Indiana, you know, I have to give this guy some props, man. I got to give him some props because he did give Indiana some great years. But at the end of the day, to say this man was elite is a long shot. All right, so the first harsh criticism I gotta have for the Dutchman is the fact that this man, no season in his career in the NBA did he ever average 10 rebounds. He was not an elite rebounder, even at 7'3"-ish, 7'4"-ish. He was not an elite rebounder. And you would think in the league at that time, a big man dominated league, he would be able to dominate the boards on a night in and night out basis. No. This man was not able to dominate the boards at all. He never averaged 10 rebounds one time in his career. Now, again, he had a solid NBA career. He was a great scorer, but his best season was only 18 points a game. 18 points a game, and he did manage to make one All-Star team. Again, we most remember him for that series when the Pacers played the Bulls, and they gave the Bulls a run for their money. Just, a few minutes away from possibly eliminating the Bulls if they could have held out those last 6 minutes of that Game 7. Unfortunately, maybe winning that Game 7 changes his career and changes the outlook of how people think about him. But unfortunately, the Pacers were not able to get it done. The Dutchman I would say he was above average. He was definitely above average, especially scoring-wise. One of the first big men who could consistently hit that mid-range jumper. It kind of reminded me of Bill Lambert, the way he could consistently hit that mid-range jumper. But again, he did not pose any threat to Shaquille O'Neal. Shaquille O'Neal loved it when Rick Smith guarded him. Definitely did not pose a threat to Hakeem or David Robinson. Again, defensively, the Dutchman was not very good at all. And again, that's quite surprising with his height at 7'4". But again, he was a solid scorer. And I know 90s fans, because they have no understanding or knowledge of defense, they would say he was a good defender because he averaged about 1.5 blocks a game. But again, that's not good enough. I would have liked to see him excel defensively. Maybe the Pacers could have went a little bit further. But we have the Dutchman, Rick Smits. Next up, we got Brad Daugherty. Now, Brad Daugherty, again, just another big who can never get over the hump. He was great. Like I said, I would have to say he had a few seasons where he was great. But to say he was great is not much, because all of the bigs under him were so average. So he was just better than a lot of average bigs in the league. And again, on a night in, night out basis, he's getting matched up against very average to below average centers. Night in, night out. You've heard the list that I just ran off. Or you heard the player breakdown of each player. These guys were not spectacular at all. Now, Brad Daugherty, he did make, I think, maybe 1 or 2 All-Star games. I cannot remember. But he was a good player. On NBA Jam, he's definitely elite. Him and Mark Price, that combination on NBA Jam is crazy. Mark Price shoot the lights out. Brad Daugherty's blocking everything. So I do like him on NBA Jam. In real life, he was a pretty good big. For whatever reason, that Cavs team, if you look at that Cavs team, they were loaded. With Gerald Wilkins, Craig Elo, Mark Price, Brad Daugherty, Larry Nance. These guys were loaded. And they couldn't get past the Bulls. Never could get past the Bulls. Could never just figure it out. Even with 2 dominant centers, or supposedly dominant bigs in Larry Nance and Brad Daugherty. So these were supposedly 2 great bigs of the 90s. But they couldn't overcome the Chicago Bulls, who, other than Bill Cartwright, Bill Cartwright was pretty trash. As you can see, Bill Cartwright's not even on this list. They had no impact or effect against Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan ran through these guys on a yearly basis. So again, if they didn't even pose a threat to a team without a center, so how could he pose a threat to guys like Shaquille O'Neal, Hakeem Olajuwon, or David Robinson? Again, it just exposes the myth that the center was full of all of these dominant bigs. Because even against teams that did not have very good bigs at all, these guys couldn't find a way to get it done. All right, but a lot of people in the 90s will tell you, oh, he ran into Michael Jordan. Yeah, well, I mean, if it's a big man era, let it be a takeover. Let it be a big. Make sure it is known that it's a big man league. But unfortunately for Brad Daugherty, his career in and of itself was pretty average. He was not a very memorable player. He was actually pretty boring to watch. Larry Nance was a bit more exciting because of the dunks and things of that nature. But Brad Daugherty, probably at that point in time, I would say the Cavs were probably one of the most boring teams in the NBA to watch. I think it was Lenny Wilkins coaching them. But like I say, it's hard to really evaluate how good he was because he played a lot of trash bigs. But we have Brad Daugherty. He was next up on that list. Now, we're about to start getting into some of the heavy hitters in the 90s, or the so-called heavy hitters of the 90s. But there's still a lot to critique about even those guys. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and hit it off with Dikembe Mutombo. We got Dikembe Mutombo of the Denver Nuggets, man. Now, this guy came out of Georgetown, defensive monster. I give that to him. He's the defensive monster. But what did I tell you guys about bigs of the 90s? If you could defend, nobody cared if you couldn't shoot a basketball, if you couldn't make a layup. If you could defend to any level that could be considered great or elite, you were going to make the NBA. Right? You were going to make the NBA. You didn't have to be a playmaker. You didn't have to be a great passer. You didn't have to shoot free throws. You didn't have to have a post game. You didn't have to be able to make a corner three or a mid-range jumper. You just had to be able to defend to a certain degree, and that's how bad centers were in the 90s. So Dikembe Mutombo definitely came in and made an impact immediately. You know, when he was playing against so many trash centers in the league at that time, they actually made him look like he was a decent scorer. So he had some years where he actually had double-digit scoring seasons. I think around 14, 15, maybe 16 points a game. But anybody who actually watched the games, especially if you watched that NBA Finals series when Mutombo played with the Sixers, it was clear to see that he was an offensive liability on the court. And at that point in time in his career, even though he was an all-star that year, he could not do anything with a player like Shaquille O'Neal. So again, Mutombo was definitely a great defender. Offensively, he was horrendous. He was terrible, horrendous offensively. But 90s fans will tell you that he was really good. They'll probably tell you that he had a good back-to-the-basket game. They'll probably tell you that he had a great hook shot. He had none of the above. He was a great defender. Just leave it at that. You don't have to force the issue with him. He's still going to go down as a Hall of Famer because of his defense. Unfortunately, his offense was non-existent. It was trash. And again, it's one of the reasons why the 76ers could not even compete when they played against the Lakers in the championship game. But I think that was in the 2000s. I don't know if that was even. I don't think that was even in the 90s. So, again, another good big, but major flaws in his game. Could he survive in the NBA today? Well, he would definitely be serviceable. Would he be able to start? Yes, he would be able to play some minutes. I don't think he would have a major impact. He would be too much of a liability on offense. And because with the matchup zone, because he's such a liability on offense, teams will be able to clutter the paint. And with the length to some of these guys, they'll still be able to guard the four guys on the perimeter. They would even allow the ball to go down to him inside. He was not an offensive threat to score. Teams would double him. Teams would probably try to make him into a playmaker, which he wasn't a great passer. And so with Mutombo with the ball in his hands and you're forcing him to be a passer, nothing good can come of that. So I think the elite strategies of the NBA today would definitely confuse Mutombo and would have to force coaches to bench him ultimately. Next up, we got Alonzo Mourning, man. We got Alonzo Mourning. Similar to Mutombo, man. Defensively, this guy was elite. Defensively, he was elite. Again, out of Georgetown as well. Georgetown had a knack for producing great bigs with John Thompson. He was another great defensive big. What was the major flaw to his game? He came into the NBA with not an ounce of offensive game in his system. He was just a great rim protector, especially in college. This is what he was known for. Now, because he was tall, because he was bigger than everybody else, and because of the fact that, again, look at the list of bigs that he had to go up against on a night-in, night-out basis. I mean, Benoit Benjamin, Luke Longley, Hot Rod Williams, Shawn Bradley, Ronnie Cycli, old Bill Lambert, old Robert Parish, Kevin Duckworth, who was also older. Again, he's not going up against heavy hitters on a night in, night out basis. Yes, he'll occasionally run into a Shaq. He'll occasionally run into a Hakeem. He'll occasionally run into a David Robinson. Outside of those three, he's not running into strictly like elite talent, Hall of Fame talent. This myth that goes around where they say that there's all of this Hall of Fame talent at the center position in the 90s is a myth. Alonzo was great defensively. He had a great career. You know, him and Larry Johnson, they were not able, for whatever reason, they could never get over the hump. Why couldn't they get over the hump in Charlotte? It was that man in Chicago, Michael Jordan. He always threw a monkey wrench in things. So when it came to all of these great bigs in the 90s, the primary person who continuously threw a monkey wrench into the situation was Michael Jordan, a 6'6" shooting guard. A 6'6" shooting guard in a league where that was supposedly more physical, more rough and tough than what the league is today. But they allowed a 180-pound 6'6" shooting guard, Michael Jordan. They allowed him to dominate them night in and night out. Now, again, it just leads me to believe that these bigs were just not as elite as a lot of people make them out to be. Now, was Alonzo great in his time in Charlotte for what he was playing against? Yes. Was he great in his time in Miami? He was serviceable. You know, he was older. He still had not developed much of an offensive game. He was always known as a cleanup guy his whole career. He's always been sound defensively. He was on that Miami Heat team with Dwayne Wade, and he was able to get a championship. So, but again, that was a shooting guard carrying that team as well, not a big. So again, across the board, we find this consistent theme with bigs. You know, as we round out this list and we come to the end, and we got Alonzo Mourning at number 5. There's still major flaws in these guys' games. These guys had non-existent offensive games, but they were always able to at least average double figures in scoring, because look at some of the names that I just ran off. They weren't really offensively, they weren't going up against a lot of defensive stoppers on the defensive end. A lot of these guys that are named off, they're not extremely stout defenders. They're not extremely mobile. And with Alonzo Mourning, he a fitness freak. He was always in optimal shape. So again, he was always going to be more athletic and faster than a lot of these centers. So he was going to always find a way to average double figures, even though he was far from elite on the offensive end. But we got Alonzo Mourning. He had a great career. Definitely will be a Hall of Famer. I do appreciate his career because he made some sacrifices in his career that affected the longevity of his career that a lot of people wouldn't have made. We definitely got to give a big thumbs up to Alonzo Mourning because, again, he did something that a lot of people wouldn't do. Next up, we got Patrick Ewing. Patrick Ewing, we remember him from his battles with Michael Jordan. He battled with Michael Jordan in the playoffs. We remember that turnaround fadeaway that he always had. We remember that funny look he always had on his face. You know, there are two things I especially remember from Patrick Ewing in the 90s. But the crazy thing is, the two biggest highlights that I remember about Patrick Ewing, he had smaller players dunking on him. I remember Jordan going baseline and then dunking on him. And then I remember Scottie Pippen on a fast break, dunking on him, standing over top of him, looking at him crazy. That's Patrick Ewing. That kind of sums up his career, but he was a great scorer. Patrick Ewing was a great scorer. He was solid defensively. I'm not going to say he was great defensively. He was solid defensively. He definitely had a hard time stopping players. When you're talking about the elite bigs of the league, he definitely had a hard time stopping the elite bigs of the league. But Patrick Ewing was an extreme ball stopper. That's what we call him. Even his teammates said, once you threw the ball into Patrick, you're not getting it back. Patrick Ewing's going to shoot that ball, whether he has 2, 3, 4, 5 players guarding him. He felt every time he touched the ball, he needed to score. And so one of the biggest hits to his game was that he did not know how to pass the ball, nor did he know when to pass the ball, regardless of who he had on his team. And some of those Knicks teams were pretty good. But Patrick Ewing was known to be an extreme ball hog. And because of that, he had a lot of usage. He got a lot of shots up, so he had some fairly decent numbers. unfortunately for Patrick Ewing. Again, what is he known for? He's simply known for getting dunked on by guards, and then he's also known for losing to Michael Jordan a lot. And that's all we can remember. Again, another supposedly Hall of Fame caliber big of the 90s who could never overcome the 6'6" shooting guard in Chicago named Michael Jordan. So again, how great were these bigs? If we're talking about a big man era, big man dominated era, ball's always going inside, physical game. Why has the league not been dominated by centers? The league was never dominated by centers, even in the 90s, which was considered a big man era. It's completely sad. But Ewing, of all the players that we just named, he had a better career than a lot of the bums that I just named. A lot of bums. So we have to give him his credit for being number 4 on this list. Now we got Shaquille O'Neal. Now with this man right here, we can't take nothing away from him. He came in the league dominating, and he came in the league dominating everybody. Tearing rims down and tearing the whole rims down in Phoenix, shattering backboards, having crazy number games. We're talking about one of the first players we've seen since Wilt putting up 30 and 20 games. But had a game where he had 15 blocks. This guy came in. I have nothing bad to say about Shaquille O'Neal other than the fact that he just offensively, if you forced him outside of the post, he was essentially useless. Now later on in his career, when he was able to develop that baby hook shot, he beat, and with the Lakers, he was definitely an offensive beast. When he started to develop his game in that aspect. Wish I could have seen him stay in shape a little bit longer. Maybe he would have added a few more elite years onto his career. But this man Shaquille O'Neal was dominant. But did his dominance have anything to do with the fact that he was going up against players like, you got Dudley, you got Chris Dudley at center, you got George Mirasan at center. You got guys like Christian Laettner at center. Benoit Benjamin at center. I mean, was he going up against elite centers? Or was a lot of the centers that he saw on a night in and night out basis, were they just extremely trash? I just named off some of these names. Arvydas Sabonis couldn't do anything with Shaq. Neither could Shawn Bradley. And old Vlade Divac couldn't do anything with Shaq. We saw that when he was with Sacramento. Ronnie Cycli probably wouldn't even think about guarding Shaquille O'Neal. Bill Lambert, at that point in time, Bill Lambert didn't want any parts of Shaquille O'Neal. Robert Parish would have died on the court if Shaquille O'Neal would have dunked on him. Kevin Duckworth, no way he could even see Shaq. Rick Smith, we saw what Shaq did to Rick Smith in the finals. Brad Daugherty he was too soft. He didn't want any parts. Mutombo, we saw what Shaq did to Mutombo in the finals. So a lot of these guys, like I said, when you talk about the elite bigs of the 90s, which there were only really 3 of them, they make cake. Everybody else was light work. Nobody else really posed a threat. There was the one man that ruled the 90s that gave all of these bigs problems was a 6'6" shooting guard out of Chicago, Michael Jordan. And he was definitely not a big, and he was on a team that didn't have any legitimate bigs in a big man era. Again, just information. I'm just trying to be informative. All right, but Shaquille O'Neal, definitely a Hall of Famer, definitely a champion in the 2000s. He did make an NBA Finals in the 90s when Jordan did retire. Jordan took a 2-year hiatus to give the NBA a break. I guess he wanted to leave a few years available for some bigs to say that they dominated the 90s. Unfortunately, Shaquille O'Neal was not able to get the job done when he made the finals. He got swept by Hakeem Olajuwon. So, like I said, there it is right there. Next up, we got the Admiral, David Robinson. Man, I love David Robinson's game. Just a sound, solid game. He played like a Navyman. I love this game. He was definitely solid defensively, and I would say he was definitely elite defensively. He stopped a lot of these guys. The only person he really could not stop was Hakeem Olajuwon. but for the obvious reasons. But, other than that, David Robinson definitely won an MVP. He did get an MVP out of the 90s, so I do give him that much. Didn't get to the finals any for whatever reason, especially in the West. And with him being in the Western Conference away from Michael Jordan in the 90s, and I think he got there in 99, but I really don't consider that. He got there in 99 when Jordan was out of the league, but in the prime of his career, in the prime years of his career, I would have loved to see him take a team to the NBA Finals. Everybody remembers Mario Elie hitting that three. I think it was against the Spurs, if I'm not mistaken. But great career. But at the end of the day, I think he's known for being a part of a championship team in the Spurs that was led by Tim Duncan, not by David Robinson. Hall of Famer, though. Number one on the list, we got Hakeem Olajuwon. Hakeem Olajuwon, man, probably I would definitely say, most skilled big man in NBA history. I mean, he had the footwork. He played like a guard. See, what made Hakeem great was he didn't play like a traditional big of the 90s. With his footwork, with his finesse, with his touch around the rim, with his ability to hit the mid-range jumper, with his ability to cross you over at the short corner, he played like a 90s style player without the range. And a lot of people think he could have actually developed that range had he been in the 90s. He's probably the only player on this list who could successfully translate his game into today's era. With the way the game is called. Again, Shaq would have problems because of the rule changes to how physical you can be. David Robinson could potentially transfer his game, but again, we never saw David Robinson really develop or even have, it never look like he could develop his game past the free throw line. Patrick Ewing, again, not being able to pass the ball with the development of the matchup zone, he would have been trash in this era. A lot of people would beg to differ, but I don't think, again, with the length, when you got players like a Jonathan Isaac and the length of some of these small forwards and even shooting guards, he's not going to be able to do that turnaround fadeaway consistently. He'd have 2-3 players on him, and with his inability to pass the ball, he would not do good in this era. So again, I think Hakeem Olajuwon is the only player whose game could directly translate into this era because of how he played. He did not play like a big. When you look at all of these bigs on this list, they play like traditional centers. They played David Robinson, Shaq, Ewing, Zoe. They were traditional centers. Hakeem Olajuwon, what made him different was he was one of the first bigs to kind of play like a hybrid power forward. All right, he was able to take bigs off that block. He was able to face you up and blow past you with his quickness. Bigs were not used to that, and he exposed it. That's how he exposed even the Hall of Famer Shaquille O'Neal in the finals. All right, we had not seen these types of things. And Hakeem essentially exposed everybody in the 90s. Now, did Hakeem do anything against Michael Jordan when Michael Jordan was in the league? Well, unfortunately, he was never even able to get a team in the 90s. He was never able to get his team into the finals until Michael Jordan was retired. When Michael Jordan took his 2-year hiatus, Hakeem Olajuwon knew it. He said, I need to get me some rings right now, because if Jordan decides to come back, it's over with for us. And again, so we have a league. Everyone knows it's dominated by a shooting guard. Even though it's a big man league, it's dominated by a shooting guard and a 6'6" shooting guard named Michael Jordan. He had to take a 2-year hiatus to save Hakeem's career. Kareem would be David Robinson. Kareem would be Patrick Ewing. Kareem would be Mutombo. He would be in the class with all of these centers if Jordan did not retire, because he would not have any championships. That's the primary thing that separates Hakeem from all of these other guys. He was able to win a championship in the 90s, but again, it was by default because the greatest player, the GOAT, Michael Jordan, had to step away from the game to win it all. And so, again, we're not just, we even if we look past, just this list, how great, when I was just going through doing my research, and I saw that, in 1996, I saw Christian Laettner even made the All-Star game. Like how good were the bigs in the NBA if Christian Laettner was able to win an All-Star game? We all remember Christian Laettner from what he did in Duke, hitting the shot. Grant Hill making a long pass, throwing it to Laettner. He's making the shot. Christian Laettner was able to make an All-Star game. So when we start talking about and critiquing some of these other guys, Marcus Camby, Luke Longley, Ronnie Cycli, Rick Smits, Hot Rod, Christian Laettner made an All-Star game. It did not take much to make an All-Star game. If Christian Laettner was able to make an All-Star game in the 90s, it did not take much to make an All-Star game. Christian Laettner was not very good. All right. And if you don't believe me, just play NBA Jam. He's even trash on NBA Jam. Everybody can score and shoot threes on NBA Jam except Christian Laettner. That's how bad Christian Laettner was. So again, that's just a testament to how trash the bigs of the 90s actually were. That Christian Laettner was able to sneak his way into an All-Star game. Not to mention that Robert Parish was able to sneak into an All-Star game in 1990, and this man was damn near 40 years old at that point in time. So, and again, we can even look to, did they win any accolades, like Finals MVPs? Did any centers in the 90s win Finals MVP? The only center in Finals that won Finals MVP was Hakeem. And again, this was accomplished when Jordan had to retire just so he could get that. So Hakeem did right to collect his MVPs, and he collected his Finals MVPs while Jordan was gone. Again, a 6'6" shooting guard on a team with trash bigs. These great elite bigs in a big man league were not able to overcome a 6'6" shooting guard. The big man era, the 1990s, the era of the big, the era where the game was so physical, the era where everybody was so tough, this era allowed a 180-pound, 6'6" guard by the name of Michael Jordan not just become great. They helped him become the greatest player of all time because of how trash they actually were. And that's just facts. That is just the facts of the matter. That is the facts of the 90s. It's not a big man era. And again, some people, and the first thing a lot of people are going to say, oh, it was the power forwards. It was, you know what? Tomorrow I'll be breaking down the power forwards as well. Tomorrow I'll break down the power forwards as well. And the power forwards list looks just as ugly. Again, you guys, and I'll go with 20. I'll pick 20 power forwards as well. The power forward list looks just as bad. It's top heavy with maybe 3 to 4 guys. But other than that, you're dealing with a lot of perennial bums. And again, maybe my standard of being a great player is higher. You actually have to win. You actually have to compete, at least get to finals and compete for championships. Like, I just ran off a list. Like, which of these guys were, when Jordan went to 6 finals in the 90s. He went to 6 NBA finals. Can somebody name the elite center that led their team up against the Chicago Bulls? When they played the Lakers at that point in time had Vlade Divac. He was not elite. All right. When they played the Blazers had Kevin Duckworth. As we can see, Kevin Duckworth was not elite. He was subpar to average. When they played the Phoenix Suns, who I don't even remember who the Phoenix Suns center was. I think they might have had a young Oliver Miller on that team. Maybe, I don't remember who the center was. Again, no elite centers were able to even lead their team to the finals against Michael Jordan. Even on the second go-around, if you look at the second go-around, we have Seattle Supersonics. They didn't have an elite center. We had, I think Sam Perkins was a center on that team. We have the Utah Jazz, who the Bulls played twice. Who was the elite center? They had Greg Ostertag. They didn't need an elite center. All right, no elite centers. Where are all these elite centers? These elite centers are not even getting teams to the finals. The David Robinsons, the Hakeems, all of these players, the Ewings, the Alonzos, the Mutombos, the Rick Smits of the world. these guys were not even able to get a sniff of the NBA Finals. Even if you were in the opposite conference, even in the opposite conference of Michael Jordan, these teams were allowing teams like the Suns, like the Utah Jazz, like the Seattle Supersonics. They were allowing teams that did not even have elite centers beat them out and get to the finals. So again, I feel like the 90s, I feel like everybody wants to over-glorify the 90s. They're over-glorifying the 90s by propping up some of these stars bigger than what they were. And because we have so, we obviously we can get footage of some of these games. But again, if you weren't living during that time, if you really weren't into basketball in that time, you can be misled by people who actually lived during this time, who say that these bigs were supposedly so great and say that these bigs would actually dominate this era. But if you use your brain, if you actually break it down and make sense of it, you will see that, again, they're just propping up an era because of the nostalgia factor. They don't want to let the 90s go. They want to always try to find a way to say that Michael Jordan played against the most elite competition when in fact he didn't. Again, they have to use these types of things to prop their era up. They have to use these types of arguments so that players like LeBron James or Kobe Bryant can never be considered to go. This is why players like Kobe and LeBron can never be considered to go, because you have so many 90s era fans who prop up the era so much, they will lead you to believe that players like Alonzo Mourning, Mutombo, Brad Daugherty, Rick Smith, Kevin Duckworth, Robert Parish, Bill Lambert, they will trick you into believing that these players were dominant in the 90s. I was having a conversation with some guys the other day, and Rick Smith was dominant. Well, how dominant was he actually? How dominant was he actually? I mean, I know he could score the ball, but could he defend? Could he rebound? How many assists did he average? Did he average at least 3 or 4 or 5 assists a year? Something? Show me some versatility in your game, something. No, what you see across the 90s, you see a lot of one-dimensional players. I ran off a list of players who were extremely one-dimensional. When we talk about Marcus Camby, he can only play one side of the ball. That was defensively. When I talk about a player like Rick Smith, one-dimensional, he only played offense. Defense was non-existent. Rebounding was non-existent. When I talk about Mutombo and Alonzo Mourning, great elite defenders, offensively they were terrible and they were liabilities offensively. But they don't want you to believe that. They don't want you, they don't want you to hear the truth. But you know what? I'm done. I don't want people to think I'm bashing on the 90s, because I'm not. Because again, there were some great players. That I feel like the top 3 or 4 guys actually had some great years. But other than Hakeem, David Robinson, and Shaquille O'Neal, all of the other bigs of the 90s had extreme flaws that were all exploited by one man. All of the bigs in the 90s were exploited by one man, and that was Michael Jordan, a 6'6", 180-pound shooting guard, who was able to be more. He was able to outclass the most elite centers in the big man era. Again, FYF Sportsman, we just here to expose the truth, man. Exposing the truth about the 90s. So, if anyone asks you about the 90s, whether you're young or old, FYF Sports is just letting you know. The 90s, the bigs of the 90s were fraudulent. I'll be the first one to tell you, Hakeem Olajuwon's championships, 100% fraudulent. Michael Jordan gifted you 2 championships. We wouldn't even be talking about Hakeem as one of the greats if Michael Jordan doesn't retire. That's facts. That's just the facts of the matter. We talk about David Robinson. He's great. We don't harp on him. We don't say David Robinson is one of the top 10 players in NBA history. The only reason we say Hakeem is one of the top 10 players in NBA history is because he's found a way to win 2 championships when Michael Jordan retired. And he saw it. He saw red. When Jordan retired, he saw red. He knew that was his only time. And after he won those championships, he then just slowly faded away. He did what he needed to do. Because, again, Jordan came back. There was nothing he could do. He wasn't a factor any longer. FYF Sports. Make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. I'm sure you guys are going to say this is a controversial video. I don't feel it's controversial. I just feel like it's factual. And again, you know what? Not only have I done my research on these players, I played a game and I got NBA Jam. So I know the fakers, man. Shaquille O'Neal, I see it's a reason why Shaquille O'Neal didn't want to be in the NBA Jam Tournament edition. See, he knew why. They was going to put his shooting. They was going to really expose his ability to shoot on that second one. On the first NBA Jam, they had this man hitting threes and everything. That was fake. David Robinson, man, same thing, man. But, again. Oh, man. Good day. All right, tomorrow I'm going to be doing power forwards. We're going to expose the power forwards of the 90s. Again, I've already exposed one of them. Chris Webber was definitely fraudulent. But let fans of the 90s tell you. They'll tell you that Chris Webber was a Hall of Famer. I guess being average, I guess not winning, I guess you just, and then you got to think. Look at some of the players Chris Webber was playing up against. To 20 and 10 doesn't really mean much when you're going up against Luke Onwey, when you're going up against Chris Dudley, when you're going up against Oliver Miller, when you're going up against an old Sam Perkins. I can run down the list of all of these bums in the 90s that I know you were going up against. You weren't just going up against these elite defensive players. Even when we talk about power forwards like Charles Barkley, he was extremely lazy on defense to the fact that where a lot of people say he didn't play it at all. So what defensive resistance were you really getting when you played? To get that 20 and 10. Yeah, 20 and 10 looks good, but you didn't have any resistance. So tomorrow we're going to expose the power forwards. So what we're going to do is we're going to dismantle the entire theory that the 90s was a big man era. And what I want them to do, what I want all these 90s fans to do, I want them to admit that the 90s was a guard era, was guard driven, and it was driven by a handful of guards because the bigs were trash. And the bigs were overrated. All right. And the guards in the 90s, again, I got something for them too. They weren't as dominant as what you think too. Again, I do all my research. I'm here to expose the 90s. So this is part 1 of 5. This is part 1 of 5 of the miniseries. This is a miniseries. I'm just gonna make it a miniseries right now. You know what? I'm gonna make a name for it. Exposing the 90s. We're gonna start with the 90s. Centers were trash. That's a good one, man. Damn. That's what we working on, man. We're gonna just expose the whole 90s. We're gonna go ahead and expose the whole 90s while we at it. Because I'm just tired of people trying to discredit what the players of this era actually do. And they try to discredit it by comparing it to what happened in the 90s. Time to break it all down. Just time to break it all down, y'all. But it's FYF Sports, man. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. And I'm so tired sitting in here having to give you guys another teaching lesson. Hey, I cannot wait till you guys see our merch line. Our merch line is coming out. Oh man, this is absolutely must buy merch, man. You're gonna have to buy this merch when you see it. But again, we're gonna be breaking that out this week as well. FYF Sports, man. I gotta get to bed. I've debunked the centers. Tomorrow, I'm on the power forwards. FYF Sports, man.